Hi, I'm John Atack, and this is a paper that I wrote quite some while ago. I think the original was in 1993. When I wrote it, I'd just become interested in this question of whether Hubbard knew that what he was doing had a relationship to hypnosis or not. So what I did was I went through all of the books that I had from 1950 to 1952, and I checked the indices, or indexes as some people like to call them. And some really good people worked in compilations in Scientology at Bridge. They really did. Because I looked up hypnosis, suggestion, reverie, the various words that are associated with hypnosis, and just wrote down what I found out. And I remember typing it all up into the computer and then printing it off and cutting it into little strips and lying down on a mattress, putting down the little slips and ordering them into groups. And so I think I ended up with 14 or 15 different groups and then constructing this paper. For me, it's the most important thing that I'd written, because for 10 years, this is 1993, for 10 years, people have been asking me, was Hubbard evil? And I felt the jury was out on that. Did he believe in what he was saying or not? And I'm not going to answer the question here. You're going to have to get right through to the end of the paper and work it out for yourself. The paper is called Never Believe a Hypnotist, which is a quotation from the Ron Hubbard book Science of Survival in 1951. Never believe a hypnotist. An investigation of L. Ron Hubbard's statements about hypnosis and its relationship to his Dianetics. There have been many assertions that cult groups, so-called cult groups, utilize techniques related to hypnotism. For example, Persinger, Kari and Seuss in TM and Cult Mania. However, to date, there has been little analysis of these groups' own teachings on the subject of hypnotic technique and manipulation. L. Ron Hubbard, founder of Dianetics and Scientology, was initially outspoken on the subject. He wrote a manual on brainwashing, falsely attributing it to Beria, who was the head of the Russian secret police, and in a letter offered to sell his brainwashing techniques to the FBI. He was also to claim, we can brainwash faster than the Russians, 20 seconds to total amnesia. That's from Hubbard Communications Office Technical Bulletin of the 22nd of July, 1956, for anyone who wants to check. We can brainwash faster than the Russians, 20 seconds to total amnesia. As well as showing genuine insight into hypnosis, Hubbard's statements are a fascinating maze of contradiction and misdirection. It soon becomes apparent that Hubbard is both eager to show off his knowledge and determined to hide something vital. That Dianetics is a form of hypnosis. Prolonged and deliberate study of Hubbard's teachings makes it impossible to escape the conclusion that Dianetics is a form of hypnosis, differing only from that subject in the words used to describe the procedures. Hubbard's own policy letter, Propaganda by Redefinition of Words, Public Relations Series 12, gives some understanding of the significance of redefinition, something Hubbard was frequently prone to. Reasonable and postulate, for instance, are words that he completely changes the meanings of. The power of redefinition is also described in part in Robert J. Lifton MD's thought reform model under the heading Loaded Language. Or indeed in Korzybski's General Semantics, the map is not the territory, the word is not the thing itself. Hubbard, of course, paid homage to Korzybski in both Science of Survival and Scientology 8008, and borrowed the misunderstood word from him. Hubbard also redefined Korzybski's various forms of isness. Korzybski's notions of the power of language figured not only as a basis for Dianetics, but also for rational emotive therapy and cognitive therapy. Never underestimate the power of words. They are fundamental to manipulation and are the stuff of which positive suggestions, or engrams, are made. Dianetics. Lafayette Ronald Hubbard is known to the world through his authorship of adventure and science fiction stories and through his creation of the Church of Scientology and its many subsidiary organisations. The Church of Scientology was itself an outgrowth of the Dianetics movement, which came into being with the incorporation of the Hubbard Dianetic Research Foundation in Elizabeth, New Jersey, in April 1950. By this time, Hubbard's first article on Dianetics, Terra Incognita, the Mind, had already appeared in the Explorers Club Journal. A second article, Dianetics, the Evolution of a Science, appeared in the May 1950 edition of Astounding Science Fiction, and was followed within days by the publication of the book Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, on the 9th of May 1950. We'll probably call it DMS MH or something like that through here. I don't know, or we'll call it Book One or something when we get to it. This book remains in print, as indeed do the first two articles, published by Scientology publishing houses, and it is still used as the basis for the Hubbard Dianetic Auditor course sold by all churches of Scientology. The current Hubbard Dianetic Auditor course seeks to re-establish Dianetic auditing as it was performed at its inception in May 1950. You can see either the Hubbard Dianetics Auditor course or the Hubbard Dianetics Seminar as references on the later use of the reintroduction of this material. In Dianetics MSMH, Hubbard claimed to have discovered a therapy which he had subsequently tested on some 273 individuals. Now, in the early editions, that's on page 51. We will provide a link to this paper online so you can check the page references and I don't have to read them all out. Later editions have different page numbering. Hubbard claimed to have discovered the single and sole cause of aberration and psychosomatic illness. Dianetics would supposedly relieve stuttering, asthma, arthritis, allergies, sinusitis, coronary trouble, high blood pressure, the common cold, poor eyesight, colour blindness, hearing deficiencies, ulcers, bursitis, eye trouble, dermatitis, migraine, tuberculosis, conjunctivitis, morning sickness, and alcoholism. There are page references for all of those things. Hubbard also claimed that Dianetics would have a marked effect upon the extension of life, which didn't prove to be true for him. His own father lived for 17 years longer than he did. Further, a clear, an individual who had successfully completed Dianetic auditing would be able to do a computation which a normal would do in half an hour in 10 or 15 seconds, and would have perfect memory or complete recall, though tested on 273 people, according to the book. I subsequently found that that was not true, but we'll go with it for the moment. Dianetics will supposedly be effective on anyone who has not been born with a grossly malformed nervous structure or had a large portion of the brain removed. So if you've only had a small portion of your brain removed, it will still work. Dianetics can be practiced straight from the book without further training, and the therapy takes between 30 and 1,200 hours. With Dianetic auditing, IQ will soar by as much as 50 points. The clear is phenomenally intelligent, with full control of his imagination, and has complete recall of everything which has ever happened to him or anything he has ever studied. It's very important to emphasize these things and to say nobody actually achieved this state. And this is his definition of something that he claimed he had proved to be true in 273 cases. The clear is clear of all irrational behaviour, compulsions, repressions, and psychosomatic ailments. Dianetics will also purportedly cure neuroses and even psychoses. These claims have never been substantiated. Testimonials are not acceptable as scientific evidence. And although Dianetics, Modern Science of Mental Health, is still sold, with no claims withdrawn, the definition of clear was cancelled inside Scientology by a 1978 bulletin, The State of Clear, which instead provides a circular definition that a clear doesn't have his own reactive mind, probably meaning that he still has myriad body thetan reactive minds, which are the little indwelling entities that you're not meant to talk about. Hubbard's research. According to his own accounts, Hubbard's research consisted of hypnotism and drug hypnotism, for which see below, clairvoyance, automatic writing, automatic speaking. I have 3 references where he says those things: clairvoyance, automatic writing, automatic speaking, and faith healing, which he says in a lecture. He also had an interest in Freud's ideas prior to the introduction of free association, when Freud changed his technique. And Dianetic technique has many points in common with Freud's early attempts at therapy. I talk about this in Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, so I'm not going to wail on about it here. The Clark lectures by Freud are where the 3rd lecture is where you'll find the Dianetic technique pretty much described as Josef Breuer had taught it to Freud. It didn't work for Breuer, and it didn't work for Freud either. Read Friedrich Kruse on the subject of Freud's life and mishaps. Hubbard also drew upon Korzybski's general semantics, Norbert Weiner's cybernetics, and psychiatric research into psychodynamic therapy, including abreaction, or reliving incidents, and drug hypnotism. Hubbard gave no mention of scientific experiments or controls, and no case histories or follow-up studies have ever been made available. So calling it a modern science was not true. It had not been scientifically studied at all. L. Ron Hubbard was 16 when he made his first brief trip to Asia with his mother in 1927. He made a second brief trip with both parents and returned to the United States in 1929. He was later to claim that he had studied hypnotism in Asia. However, Hubbard's claim to have visited India is spurious. His claim to have visited Mongolia is spurious, and his claim to have visited Tibet is spurious. But he did visit China twice. He said in his journals of the time, which Scientology put into the first Armstrong case in 1984, so inadvertently they gave me copies of them, which I gave to the world. In those diaries, he says the only trouble with China is there are too many chinks there. This is not, as he later claims, study with gurus in Asia. But so he said he started learning hypnotism certainly by 1929, because he says he learned about it in Asia. Those are his only journeys to Asia until many years later, when he did actually go, I think, to Calcutta Airport. So he did visit India, but I don't think he met any gurus there. And the claim to have met gurus and studied with them comes before the journey to Calcutta. So, therefore, Hubbard claimed to have been a practitioner of hypnotism for more than 20 years prior to the release of Dianetics and Modern Science of Mental Health. So, 1929, 1950. Hubbard was also knowledgeable about the history of hypnotism. He posited an early date for its discovery. The art of hypnotism is very old, tracing back some thousands of years, and is existing today in Asia as it has existed apparently from the dawn of time. That's on page 12 of Dianetics, Modern Science of Mental Health. From India, it long ago filtered to Greece and Rome, and it has come to us via Anton Mesmer. Same book, page 252. Hubbard also referred to the works of Bernheim and Charcot. Charcot is listed as one of the men without whom the creation and construction of Dianetics would not have been possible in the acknowledgement page in Science of Survival. Hubbard asserted that hypnotism is a fundamental principle in several mystic arts, and that its mechanics were known even to the Sioux medicine man. That's the Lakota to you and me. Knowledge of hypnotism, according to Hubbard, is widespread, very common. Further, hypnotism was a sort of constant thread through all the cults, his word, not mine, or hypnotic practices. Hypnotism is used in some base religions and is commonly employed in obsolete mental therapies. His words, not mine. Base religions and obsolete mental therapies. Whenever shamans, medicine men, exorcists, or even modern psychologists go to work, they incline towards practices which are hypnotic. How true. In his second published article, Dianetics, the Evolution of a Science, Hubbard described a hypnotic session and said that it had taken him 9 years to understand its importance. Hubbard described a number of hypnotic experiments. Indeed, they constitute almost the entire of his recorded experiments, if we can call them experiments. The recording is just being his notes about them. Unfortunately, case notes have never been available. Hubbard was versed in various approaches to hypnotism. It is often possible to waken a sleeping person into a deep trance simply by speaking to him quietly, several nights in succession, at the same hour, and finally getting him to respond to the invitation to talk. I wonder how he found that out. Hubbard described his obviously frequent use of amnesia or deep trance, claiming that his conclusion about amnesia trance was substantiated by a large amount of experimentation. Dianetics and hypnotism. Despite such admissions, Hubbard made several adamant statements about the use of hypnotism in Dianetic procedure. Hypnotism is not used in Dianetic therapy. And is Dianetics a kind of hypnotism? Absolutely not. Alongside these denials comes the statement that hypnotism is not used to any extent in Dianetic therapy, which is also in the book Dianetics. Hubbard flatly contradicted his statement that hypnotism is not used by saying that if a pre-clear drops into a hypnotic trance, the motto is, work with him where he lies. If he drops into a half-hypnotized state, just by closing his eyes, work him there. It's from a lecture. Hubbard also asserted that the mechanism by which the mind is able to cause physical disability or predispose the body to an illness and perpetuate sickness is, in its basic cause, a very simple thing. A series of simple tests can be made on drugged or hypnotic patients which will prove clinically in other laboratories this basic mechanism. A series of these tests were run in the formulation of Dianetics with uniform success. So, tests on drugged or hypnotic patients. A series of these tests were run in the formulation of Dianetics with uniform success, drugged or hypnotic patients. Hubbard called hypnotism an excellent research tool in Dianetics. He was also to say that he used an awful lot of hypnotism in early research. That's from a lecture called Methods of Research, the Thetan as an Energy Unit, 6th of November 1952. This conflicts with his assertion that the investigation which led to the discovery of Dianetics was not approached through hypnotism. So it was an excellent research tool, used an awful lot of hypnotism in early research, and Dianetics was not approached, the discovery was not approached through hypnotism. Adding, however, and hypnotism is just another tool, a tool which is only occasional use in the practice of Dianetics. To further confound this picture, in the same text, Hubbard explained how to hypnotize someone in their sleep, see above, and added, Dianetic therapy can be entered upon and pursued, and it will succeed. Again in the same text, Hubbard said, hypnotism was used for research, then abandoned. So it wasn't used, it was used extensively. We have many choices. Again in the same text, Hubbard said hypnotism was used for research, then abandoned. A few months later, Hubbard said a renowned hypnotist is currently running a series of tests on Dianetics. We never heard about them. So something went wrong there, I imagine. It's probably to do with the Los Angeles Dianetics experiments, which we may talk about, the only time there was an attempt to scientifically support Dianetics, and it failed miserably. In a lecture given 3 months after the publication of Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health, Hubbard attributed a major discovery, prenatal memory, to a session in which he placed a volunteer in amnesia trance, deep trance. So he discovered prenatal memory by putting somebody into a deep trance. In the same lecture, he also credited his use of de-intensification, where a patient goes through the memory of an incident repeatedly, to his study of hypnotism. Having denied that Dianetics came out of hypnotic research, Hubbard proceeded to regale his reader with tales of his hypnotic work. Many general statements were made about his work with hypnotism. External evidence supports Hubbard's practice of hypnotism. See particularly Barefaced Messiah by Russell Miller, pages 140 to 41, where he interviewed the brother of someone who was hypnotized by Hubbard in the 40s. And even taking into account Hubbard's propensity for exaggeration, it's evident that he had considerable experience as a hypnotist. Don Rogers, one of Hubbard's few close associates during the year preceding publication of the first book, has said that Hubbard used deep trance until he was commissioned to write the book in January 1950. And Don Rogers had no axe to grind. He still liked Hubbard when I talked to him around 1984-85. You can find the letters he wrote to me on Tony Ortega's underground bunker. And he left. He was on all of the board of every Hubbard Foundation from the start till 1954, I think, when he decided that he was now absolutely fine. He didn't need any more of this stuff. And so he left. And until I contacted him 30 years later, he had nothing to do with it. And sadly, he went back to them and probably gave them a load of money. But he was an old bloke by then. But he was a lovely man, and he never said anything negative to me about Hubbard. He sort of made some wry comments about Hubbard's ability to spend money, like water, which a phrase I've heard on many occasions. And I think Don used it. But he was on friendly terms with him. So when he says, when he was working with him on a daily basis back in Bayhead, New Jersey, that he was using deep trance hypnosis, and that, there was no research into the so-called reverie method before the book was commissioned in January 1950. He wrote the book in 6 weeks. Some places he says 3 weeks. He also has said that he used automatic writing for that. So there you go. But that book was written with no new research. The method had never been tried by Hubbard, as far as we know. Don Rogers, one of Hubbard's few close associates during the year preceding publication of the first book, has said that Hubbard used deep trance until he was commissioned to write the book in January 1950. He abandoned the practice because he thought it was unpopular. The public don't like hypnosis, they're scared of it. In his second article, Hubbard admitted, "I knew hypnotism was, more or less, a fundamental." That's an evolution of a science. And said that hypnosis was examined. Hubbard also claimed to have used hypnoanalysis, psychoanalysis practiced on a hypnotized subject, and recommended a book on the subject, Hypnotism Comes of Age by Wolf and Rosenthal. In an early lecture, Hubbard said that he had worked a case in amnesia trance. He advised against amnesia trance, but added, "It has been subjected to much research, and if other methods cannot be used, amnesia trance can be employed." The power of hypnotism. Hubbard said he had once swamied one young man into a deep trance. That's in a lecture. He had also used light trance in another lecture, a hypnotic condition which is still unrecognised by the general public, for the most part, because you can't see that the person is hypnotised in any way, and you don't generally see how the process works when it's being done. But we all, in fact, have a quite natural hypnotic state, which allows us to learn things, to memorise things, but it can have some disadvantages in terms of making us unaware of suggestions that are made to us by environmental people within the environment. Priming. So something to look up and stop wasting your time watching me. No, stay here. So he had also used light trance, a hypnotic condition which is still unrecognised by the general public, until I just explained what it was there. Hubbard had hypnotised a man who came to him, insisting that I drive him crazy. I threw him into a deep trance and gave him the full routine. I gave him the suggestion, wiped the whole experience out of his mind, wiped out the experience of his coming to tell me that he wanted it done, woke up his patient, and had a psychotic on my hands. Hubbard also claimed to have worked upon a number of manic depressives, most of them by straight hypnosis. He spoke of an experiment, and that's in the book Dianetics, by the way. He spoke of an experiment with a gentleman unable to absorb testosterone, whose inability had been remedied by hypnotism. According to Hubbard, the effects obtainable through hypnotism are impressive. The heart, by positive suggestion alone, can be speeded up, slowed down, or otherwise excited, blood flow can be inhibited, which actually are quite easy things to do anyway. If you just see something showing your pulse rate, you can slow your heart down on. So that one's need a lot of hypnotism for that. Excreta are among the easiest things to regulate by suggestion. The urine can also be so controlled. I'm not sure why you'd want to. And so can the endocrine system. Now, he emphasizes that, and so can the endocrine system. You can control the hormonal system, the enzyme system within your body using hypnotism. That seems like an incredibly wild claim to me. Though you could probably get cortisol release by scaring somebody sufficiently, and serotonin by saying something nice to them. Going, no, you can't have it, so that they'll get dopamine. Hubbard admitted using hypnotism to alter his own blood flow. He also asserted that the thyroid gland could be regulated by hypnotism. Hypnotism can be used to cure stammering on 1 patient out of 10, and hearing, sight and touch can all be extended through the use of hypnotism. By suggestion, the power of hearing can be tuned down or up, so that a person is nearly deaf or can hear pins fall at a great distance. Having made these assertions, Hubbard added, in a book published in June 1951, this is Science of Survival, even such a degraded practice as hypnotism, it's a degraded practice now, can, by the implantation of positive suggestions, suppress certain physical and mental disorders. Though these are suppressed in one quarter, they will manifest themselves as something entirely different. Hypnotism can, in a small percentage of cases, eradicate the psychosomatic illness, but will produce in its stead a lowered emotional tone. So you will go down tone, you will not be as cheerful. If your psychosomatic illness is cured in this way. Now, this is you're going to have to watch this 7 or 8 times because it's so dense with information. But I think that if you want to become somebody, you can go out and give lecture tours about Ron Hubbard, that is, which you probably don't. Hypnotism still has one valid use. Anesthetic hypnosis is wonderful. Or further, hypnotism may still have enormous therapeutic or anesthetic value. However, any benefit derived from hypnotism is in the field of research or the installation of a temporary manic engram. Now, an engram is a recording of a traumatic experience while unconscious. So he's talking about installing a manic engram. An engram that will make you super happy, too happy. I'm not quite sure what that's about. The alleviation of engrams, purportedly repressed memories of unconsciousness or pain, forms the entire basis of Dianetic belief and practice. There isn't anything but getting rid of your engrams. So you can install them if you want as well. Manic ones, for some reason. In his second article, Hubbard said of hypnotism, on some people it works, on most it doesn't. On those on whom it works, it sometimes achieves good results, sometimes bad. However, in a manuscript supposedly written prior to this article, this is a book that was published as Dianetics, the original thesis, which as far as I can tell, was actually written later. This is not the original manuscript said to be from 1948. References within it make that seem wrong. He was a bit of a rush when he wrote it, I think. But it purportedly, supposedly written prior to this article, so 48, 49, Hubbard said hypnotism as such does not work. So we've had cases that it does work for here. It can relieve various things, but it doesn't work. That's what we're being told here. The dangers of hypnotism. Hypnotism is dangerous and belongs in the parlour in the same way you would want an atom bomb there. Dianetics. It may be sufficiently destructive to cause the engrams to re-stimulate to the point of insanity. This is having told us that he made somebody psychotic using, but never mind. Hypnotism reduces self-determinism by interposing the commands of another below the analytical level of an individual's mind, so you're not conscious of it. It is the sort of control mechanism in which an authoritarian individual, cult, or ideology delight. People who indulge in hypnotism may only very occasionally be interested in experimentation upon the human mind. Genuine, so people like Charcot, Freud, Pierre Janet may have been genuinely interested in the human mind. Genuine experimental hypnotism, strictly in the laboratory and never in the parlour, and done wholly in the knowledge that one is reducing the efficiency of the human being on whom one is experimenting, and may do him permanent damage. And the use of hypnotism by a surgeon should end the extension of hypnotism into the society. Submission to being hypnotised is analogous to being raped, with the exception that the individual can generally recover from being raped. Just like to point out that in January 1949, when he was in Savannah, Georgia, visiting Major Arthur J. Burks, Ron Hubbard wrote a letter to his literary agent, Forry Ackerman, in which he said that he had come across a technique which had more selling angles than anything he'd ever seen, but also would allow him to rape women without them ever knowing. So, and that's the letter he wrote to his literary agent that's publicly available. Again, I think Tony Ortega put it up at the bunker. And I checked the letters through the friend who got them from Forry Ackerman. We made very sure that we got the real thing there. Submission to being hypnotised is analogous to being raped, with the exception that the individual can generally recover from being raped. To any clear-thinking human who believes in the value of people as human beings, there is something gruesomely obscene about hypnotism. The interjection of unseen controls below the level of consciousness cannot benefit, but can only pervert the mind. The individual who would permit himself to be hypnotised is, frankly, a fool. It was thought by hypnotists that the mere remembering of suggestions would relieve them, and that the power of the suggestion died out with time. These two ideas do not happen to be true. Once hypnotised, always hypnotised. And yet, the 273 cases he used to research Dianetics were all using hypnosis, deep trance hypnosis. So they must all have been fools, according to what he says here. I'd also like to point out that not one of those 273 people has ever come forward to say that Hubbard worked with them. And in a letter a few months before publishing Dianetics, he said he worked on 40 cases. So he'd added like another 233 in a couple of months. He exaggerated a bit, you know, take it easy on the man. He couldn't help it. In Dianetics, One Times for Mental Health, Hubbard said more succinctly, hypnotism can be extremely aberrative, meaning it can make you irrational. Indeed, Hubbard asserted that there are many suicides pursuant to the practice of hypnotism. Self-hypnosis, however, can be resolved fairly easily. Hubbard classified the hypnotist as having a permanent emotional condition ranging from apathy through grief, sympathy or fear to rage, indeed, of being without positive emotions. So he admits to doing it himself for 20 years, extensively, and then he says that a hypnotist is somebody who has a permanent, what he would call down or low tone emotion. They can't get up above rage, anger. Having vouched for the power of hypnotism, Hubbard dismissed the hypnotist as a charlatan. Dianetics, the original thesis. He said, one of the chief weapons of the pervert is hypnotism. And about 0.5% of all cases run have had pervert hypnotism in the memory bank, in the bank, in their memories. In contradiction to these statements is the following. An individual in an hypnotic trance will rarely perform an immoral act, even though commanded to do so by the hypnotist, lest that individual would normally perform such acts. So they're not perverts. That statement is often repeated, that people wouldn't do under hypnosis what they would normally do, and it's a silly statement because it's very easy to disprove. If you give somebody a toy gun, if you give them a real gun and say it's a toy gun while they're in a hypnotized state, and say, let's play cowboys and Indians, what do you think will happen? And is the person responsible? Well, go figure. And that statement's from June 1951, that people don't do stuff under hypnosis that they wouldn't normally do. More than a year before, Hubbard had said perverts quite commonly use hypnotism, despite the fact that the moral nature is supposed to rise in a hypnotized subject. So they're more moral. Narcosynthesis and aberrative therapy. I remember the first book I read, the first Scientology book I read was Science of Survival. I wasn't involved. It was a friend of mine was a big fan of the Incredible String Band, and he'd heard that they were involved with Scientology. So I'd gone to the library and borrowed this book, read a few words and decided it wasn't for him, and left it there. And I happened to turn up one day and there was nobody there, so I read it. I read the first book, it's divided into two books. I read the first book straight through. And there's this word, narcosynthesis, in there. And in Scientology, you're meant to clear words. You're meant to understand what they mean. And I was unable for years to find any definition of narcosynthesis until I read some of the books recommended by Hubbard about hypnotism. And suddenly, I think it's in Hypnotism Comes of Age, there's this word, narcosynthesis. And it means achieving a state by using drugs. It's narcosynthesis and aberrative therapy. Aberration is where you get somebody to abreact or to relive an experience, supposedly. During the Second World War, both US and British psychiatrists were experimenting with a form of therapy which induced hypnotic states through the use of drugs. Dr. William Sargent has left a description of his work on soldiers with battle neurosis or combat fatigue, which these days we tend to call post-traumatic stress disorder, in his Battle for the Mind in 1957. Doctors Roy Grinker and John Spiegel published an account of their work in 1945 under the title Men Under Stress. The barbiturates and sodium pentothal were used in this work, which also relied upon Pavlov's discovery of conditioned responses and Freud's concepts of the unconscious mind and repression. Just a quick note that Freud was not the first person to talk about the unconscious mind. It was spoken of before he was born. Grinker and Spiegel called their work narcosynthesis because it used narcotic sedation to assist the patient to rebuild or synthesize the personality. As with Dianetics, in narcosynthesis, the patient was required to abreact or re-experience traumatic events. Hubbard was familiar with this work. Not only did he recommend a book which describes it, yes, it is Wolf and Rosenthal Hypnotism. It's a long time since I read this. Wolf and Rosenthal's Hypnotism Comes of Age. He mentions the book in a lecture. But he also referred to narcosynthesis directly. One will find regression if one treats soldiers who have been unlucky enough to undergo narcosynthesis. He was merely sick before, but now he is crazy. Anything which is touched in narcosynthesis is apt to be restimulated permanently. Hubbard even suggested the headline, "Man released from Veterans Hospital on Tuesday kills wife on Thursday." This was after he himself had been released from the Veterans Hospital and not killed any of his 3 wives. It seems eminently possible that Hubbard encountered narcosynthesis, or at least discussion of it, during his stay at Oakland Naval Hospital in 1945. Hubbard claimed to have treated schizophrenics with narcosynthesis. It's in Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, in my edition, which is the earlier editions at page 123, and he talks about it for a little while. So he claimed to have treated schizophrenics, that is to say, people who have the most severe form of psychotic illness, and he treated those with narcosynthesis using drugs to get them to re-experience something. He also claimed that he'd done further drug hypnotism on cases which had already been cured by narcosynthesis. So he worked with people who'd had narcosynthesis, according to Evolution of a Science. In a lecture given a few weeks after publication of this article, Hubbard warned against the practice of narcosynthesis. He also says in Dianetics, drug hypnotism is dianetically illegal. However, A few days after the lecture, Hubbard said it is allowable to produce more accessible conditions by amnesia trance, and even by drugs. He says you mustn't do it, and a couple of days, 2 days later, in another lecture says you can if you want. In one of his first lectures, Hubbard had said narcosynthesis and other drug therapies have some slight use in Dianetics, even though they'll drive you crazy. Hubbard's research not only included decades of straight hypnosis, he also gave the idea that his work with narcosynthesis was extensive. Tests have been made on people who could be hypnotized and people who could not but were drugged. They brought forth valuable data for Dianetics. So not only did he include hypnotism in his research, and plenty of it, but he also used drugs. And we can piece that together a little bit later on. One day, a multivalent patient, multiple identity patient, under drugs went back to his birth. So there you go. Hubbard claimed knowledge of the use of pain drug hypnosis in espionage work in Science and Survival in 1951. Whether this was simply a guess was based upon the confession of a member of the small US intelligence teams involved with such projects as Operation Bluebird, or indeed, if Dianetics was a US Navy intelligence experiment, we do not know. I doubt it, but it's strange that he was able to mention something that would not be mentioned in print for more than 20 years by anyone else, as far as I know. More alarming is Hubbard's assertion that the Hubbard Dianetic Research Foundation undertook some tests with regard to the effectiveness of pain drug hypnosis and found it appallingly destructive. Pain drug hypnosis. So you knock people out basically by thumping them. That's what they tried to do in Los Angeles, as far as I can tell. This attempt to prove the engram hypothesis failed. They were not able ever to recover what had been said to the person after they'd knocked them out. It's the only attempt at checking the reality of the engram. It also seems highly unlikely that engrams exist because memory research shows us that if you try and access the seconds before a boxer is knocked out, they won't ever be able to remember them. Doesn't matter what you do, because memory formation takes several seconds. And so because they were knocked out, they won't have formed the memory. So it's pretty unlikely that memories are being recorded when you're unconscious, which undermines all of Dianetics, I know. Hubbard's drug research. Hubbard said that sedative drugs cause the individual to walk around in a light, hypnotic trance, and said continuous application of sedatives to an individual makes him more suggestible. So if you're taking Valium, it's probably not good for you. Hubbard admitted testing drugs and gave as one of his conclusions, so far, soporifics have been tested and rejected. That whole block of sedatives like scopolamine, opium, phenobarbital are of no assistance in Dianetics. Hubbard's understanding of this was personal, having explained the damage caused in the highly suggestible state brought about by constant use of phenobarbital, which is a barbiturate. Hubbard said, "I know because I made myself a guinea pig on one of those experiments, and trying to get off a soporific was a tough job." So a drug that puts you to sleep, a soporific. As in the first edition of the Research and Discovery volumes, which are transcripts of Hubbard lectures from 1950. It's on page 24 in that first volume, but you'll only find it in the first edition, I suspect. Or the actual recording, if you can get your hands on it. They have published a lot of recordings that make admissions that contradict his later statements. He named the barbiturate drug phenobarbital as the soporific to which he had been addicted. It was probably prescribed him for his purported ulcer in San Diego in 1943. He was still trying to obtain phenobarbital in East Grinstead as Dr. Hubbard. As late as 1965, the drug was called Nembutal in the UK, so that's on the prescription. His Veterans Administration records show that he was taking phenobarbital for some time. The year-ish that he spent in Oak Knoll Hospital, phenobarbital was the basic medicine he was taking. So, yeah, he did become addicted to it. As he says, Don't think there's any contention there. Whether he did it as a guinea pig in an experiment or not is another matter, but he did become addicted to it. This is the drug most used in aberrative narcosynthesis. So it is kind of interesting that he took loads of it. Hubbard also claimed to have administered nitrous oxide to 3 people, which of course was Rajneesh's drug of choice. Me nasty, me nasty. He used to take it once or twice a day to keep himself in a cheerful, enlightened mood. He said that nitrous oxide was a first-class hypnotic. While he condemned the use of soporifics, though his attitude seems to have been ambivalent in light of his positive comments about narcosynthesis, Hubbard encouraged the use of amphetamines, recommending benzodrine in particular. That's found in the book Dianetics, page 363 in the early editions, page 389 in the later editions, because that one's kind of important. The founder of Narconon, the originator of the Narconon drug program, recommending the use of amphetamines. It's also mentioned in 1, 2, 3, 4 lectures I've listed, the use of amphetamines, so not much doubt there. Hear it in his own voice. Curiously, although Scientology sponsors Narconon and claims to be drug-free, its best-selling publication, Dianetics and Modern Science and Mental Health, says making one drug immoral and another taxable is a sample of the alcohol engram in society. On the same page, Hubbard says that opium, marijuana and phenobarbital are all less dangerous than alcohol. There is no prohibition on Scientologists drinking, however. Hypnotism and mental illness. Hubbard asserted that it was possible using drugs and hypnotism to drive somebody insane by accident. Further, we could go down the catalogue of mental ills, and by concocting positive suggestions, we could bring about in the awakened state a semblance to every insanity. With various suggestions, one could create the appearance of various neuroses, psychoses, compulsions, and repressions listed by the psychiatrist. Hubbard abandoned such research with the realization that hypnotism and insanity were somehow identities, that is to say, identical. So hypnotism is insanity. He claimed that a catatonic, somebody who doesn't move at all, will respond to suggestion where substitutes for reality are given. So given a broom and told it's a red-hot poker, the catatonic will respond as if it were. However, the catatonic will come out of trance if presented with a real poker. It seems something of a contradiction for a catatonic to respond to anything, but that's what the condition is. Hubbard claimed to have hypnotized psychotics and said, in the treatment of a real full-blown psychotic, the use of deep trance is handy to know. He also said, however, it's very difficult to produce hypnosis in a psychotic. The knowledge of Hubbard's ideas allegedly gives considerable power to the individual. The axioms of Dianetics, not Dianetic therapy, can be used by a sadist to implant insanity. We wonder how he found this out. This is more potent than one of his descriptions of hypnotism. A few people can be hypnotized, many cannot be. Hypnotic suggestions will sometimes take, and sometimes they won't. Sometimes they make persons well, sometimes they make them ill. Though the attempt to hypnotize a patient can throw them into a traumatic memory or engram. So a sadist could implant insanity using the Dianetic axioms. How did he know that? Trance induction. Hubbard described one method of inducing trance. A person can be sleeping quietly and someone comes up alongside of him and says, "I like you, I'm very fond of you." An affinity starts to be established. Then he commands in a quiet, calm voice, "You can talk to me, but it isn't necessary for you to awaken at this moment. You can talk to me without disturbing yourself." Try it on 3 or 4 successive occasions, and you will sometimes discover that the person is coming up into an amnesia trance out of sleep. He will have no recollection of what has gone on when he finally awakens from that sleep. This method has peculiar value between husbands and wives who sleep together. One lady whose husband was a war veteran was instructed in this method. He had refused therapy utterly and was very badly aberrated. With instructions from me, she was able to awaken him into an amnesia trance and carry on his therapy without him knowing anything about it. It took many months to do anything for him. So he trains the woman, she uses the technique for months, he's aware that she's using the techniques, he is, in Scientology terms, her case supervisor. This is a little strange because his second wife, Sarah, the one he said in the Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard he never had, his second wife was with him while Dianetics was being concocted and released to the world. She was with him from 1946 onwards. And she claimed that he hypnotized her in her sleep, or tried to hypnotize her in her sleep. So between husbands and wives, this could be a useful technique, though hypnosis is very dangerous. Amnesia trance. Hubbard complained that resolution of a case would take 3 times as long using amnesia trance rather than his own Dianetic reverie. However, the actual therapeutic value one can get in working painful emotion in deep trance is pretty good. A whole case can be worked from beginning to end in amnesia trance. However, Hubbard also said that engrammic commands, the target of Dianetic auditing, are not reversible by hypnosis. So you can use it, but it doesn't work. It does work, and it doesn't work. And you will learn not to work someone in amnesia trance if you can possibly help it. Of amnesia or deep trance, Hubbard said, this method has many things wrong with it. The entire duration of treatment is very long and difficult. The patient ordinarily speaks very slowly, is unable to contact traumatic incidents, his computational ability on his own life is very poor, and he will be uncomfortable during almost the entire period that you're working with him. Hypnotism also carries with it transference and enormous operator responsibility. Transference is the idea of moving your emotions onto another person, becoming attached to them. And indeed the complaint that Freud made about the technique that was to be renamed Dianetics is that it increases transference, that it makes a person more dependent on the therapist, the analyst, or whatever. Hypnotic induction. In a lecture given a few months after the publication of Dianetics, Hubbard described an hypnotic induction thus: the hypnotist will seat the person in a chair or have them lie down, and he will start off his patter something like this. Now, I want you to relax. There is nothing to be afraid of. There is nothing wrong with being hypnotized. You're going to sink into a little sleep. It's going to be more relaxing and a deeper sleep than you have ever experienced in your life. If the subject is at all suggestible, he is already about half hypnotized, merely by suggestion. Then the hypnotist starts in and says very calmly, go to sleep, go to sleep. He may then make passes across the person's face. Go to sleep. Now you can feel your muscles relaxing. Now all through your body you can feel your muscles relaxing. Now first your toes are going to relax, and now your legs are going to relax, and now your hips are going to relax, and now you can feel your back relaxing. You can feel your hands relaxing. You can feel your arms relaxing. You can feel the back of your neck relaxing. You can feel your mind relaxing. You can feel your face relaxing. And your eyes are closing. Your eyes are closing, and they're closing more and more. It's very difficult for you to keep your eyes open. In fact, you will find it impossible for you to keep your eyes open when I have counted from 1 to 5, from 1 to 10, or some other such series. Or he merely makes passes. Then he says, go to sleep, deeper, deeper, deeper sleep. Now lie there quietly and go to sleep. You can only hear the sound of my voice telling you to go to sleep. All you can hear is the sound of my voice. Nothing else will disturb you. Go to sleep. He keeps this up for a while, and then as the subject drops off into a light sleep, he lets it deepen. There are many ways to deepen that sleep, one of which is to put one's index finger and thumb on the patient's closed eyelids and say, I am going to press you back to a deeper sleep. This is very interesting because go back to sleep is a phrase which makes a person, whenever he goes to sleep, travel back down the time track, which is the sequential record of memory, and is not the natural method of sleeping. It's like a little bit of ASMR there. I hope nobody goes and cuts this out and uses it. I'll be in real trouble. Go to sleep. John says go to sleep. Hypnosis defined. According to Hubbard, hypnosis is a relatively simple mechanism. By deep trance or drugs, we take a patient into amnesia trance, a state of being wherein the I is not in control, but the operator, the hypnotic operator, is the I, the self, the locus of control, the psychologists say. And that's all there is really to the function of hypnosis, the transfer of analytical power through the law of affinity from subject to operator, a thing which had a racial development and survival value in animals which ran in packs. There you go. That's Ron Hubbard. Although Hubbard was adamant that hypnosis is not sleep, it is another mechanism. He also asserted that the hypnotist has success where he does, because he is able, by talking to people about sleep, to put into re-stimulation some engram which contains the word sleep and shut down analytical power. While Hubbard asserted that most people cannot be hypnotized, he also said the person who does not have go back to sleep in his engram bank someplace is a rare one and should be put in a museum because he is a strange creature. Having said all of this, Hubbard recommended the use of the phrase "go to sleep" in Dianetic auditing as a phrase to be repeated by the patient or pre-clear. That's in a lecture in the 3rd volume of Research and Discovery. So this is online. Please spot check it. I'm sick and tired of academics ignoring my work because they're too lazy to look at the references I give. It's not me saying this, it's Ron Hubbard saying it. Hubbard gave various descriptions of hypnotism. For example, hypnotism is the entering of the hypnotist's personality and desires below the choice level of the individual, and hypnotism is the art of implanting positive suggestions in the engram bank. That's again in Dianetics and Modern Science of Mental Health. By the time Science of Survival was published in June 1951, Hubbard asserted that hypnotism never has and never will raise an individual on the emotional tone scale. It won't make you more cheerful. Which is to say, hypnotism can have no positive emotional effect. In Dianetics, Modern Science of Mental Health, Hubbard was eager to differentiate between hypnotism and Dianetics. Once upon a time, an art known as hypnotism used what was called regression on hypnotized subjects, the hypnotist sending the subject back in one of two ways to incidents in his past. This was done with trance techniques, drugs, and considerable technology. The hypnotic subject would be sent back to a moment entirely, so that he gave every appearance of being the age to which he was returned, with only the apparent faculties and recollection he had at that moment. This was called revivification, or reliving. Regression was a technique by which part of the individual self remained in the present and part went back to the past. Hubbard said that his method is different. Returning is substituted for regression here because it's not a comparable thing, and because regression as a word has some bad meanings which would interrupt its use. Reliving is substituted for revivification in Dianetics because in Dianetics the principles of hypnotism can be found explained and hypnotism is not used in Dianetic therapy, though he has earlier on said that you can use it. The difference between the hypnotic forms and the new Dianetic forms is not made clear in the text, just the different words, only Hubbard's insistence that they are different. As we have seen, prenatal memory and de-intensification, two ideas essential to Dianetics, according to Hubbard, both derive from hypnotic practice. Positive suggestions. Hubbard made various assertions about suggestion. Positive suggestion means in hypnosis a suggestion which is given to a hypnotized subject which will result in some change in the manifestations and actions of that patient. It is a suggestion by the operator to a hypnotized subject with the sole end of creating a changed mental condition in the subject by implantation of the suggestion alone. It is a transplantation of something in the hypnotist's mind into the patient's mind. The patient is then to believe it and take it as part of himself. I would strongly suggest that Scientology fits this description for anybody who wants to seriously think about that statement, that the operator, Ron Hubbard, is putting his ideas into the mind of the subject, basically pre-clear, pre-OT or whatever you used to call them, because you're not, through auditing, achieving individuality. You are realizing that what Ron Hubbard says is true. So the self-determinism part of Scientology is agreeing with what Ron Hubbard says and not being able to discover things yourself, because only Hubbard was capable of discovering technology and this kind of thing, which, you know, a little bit of a contradiction there. Transplantation of something in the hypnotist's mind into the patient's mind. The patient is then to believe it and take it as part of himself. Shut down the person's analyzer, the analytical mind, conscious mind, and what follows goes in as positive suggestion, just as though he was hypnotized. Shut down the person's analyzer. They're not analyzing things, they're not taking them apart, checking them, testing them. They're just doing what it says on the page before them, you know, which I did a lot of. He cannot reason on this data. He can only react, and he reacts as dictated by the engram. So hypnotic period being an amnesia trance is fundamentally an engram Scientology. And that's a very interesting idea. Hypnotic suggestion is very powerful. No matter how foolish a suggestion is given to a subject under hypnosis, he will carry it out one way or another. Any suggestion will operate within his mind, unbeknownst to his higher levels of awareness. Very complex suggestions can be given. The chap that Russell Miller interviewed in Los Angeles said that in the late 40s, Hubbard had hypnotized his brother to go to a particular street corner at the same time once a week. And for some time afterwards, his brother went to that street corner. So, you know, never believe a hypnotist. That's Ron Hubbard telling you that, giving that advice. Never believe a hypnotist, unless it's Ron Hubbard. Hubbard went on to say that neuroses, psychoses, compulsions and repressions can all be perfectly imitated through positive suggestion. Hubbard assured his followers, we never give positive suggestions. We also never talk in generalities. According to Hubbard, if one put a hypnotic suggestion on the time track, that is in the person's memory, which says you can write, and the next day put another positive suggestion on the time track saying you can't write, the person will go on writing. This agrees actually with Freud's assertion that later trauma is held in place by earlier trauma. The notion of chains, which is the word used in both Freud's text and many years later, 40 years later in Hubbard's. So the earlier incident will be the more potent on that chain of incidents. Paraphernalia. The depth of Hubbard's research into hypnotism is also evident in his ideas for improving hypnotic technique. He referred to the use of a flashing light or a Charcot mirror and added that fixation of attention can be achieved with spinning mirrors and light. Not might be, can be. Further, this could be reduced much more easily on a technical basis by having a type of mask tipped over the face that has a spot of light in front of each eye that flashes. However, Hubbard asserted that this device would not induce a hypnotic state. He advocated the use of this device when applying Dianetics to the severely neurotic or psychotic person. So it'd be quite funky, wouldn't it? Little mask flashing. Could be quite cheaply done with LEDs these days. Who needs it? You can get a virtual reality thing anyway, have that flash at you. Informal trance inductions. Hubbard was well aware that the formal hypnotic session is not the only way to induce so-called trance states. This is really important. In his second article, he spoke of hypnotic practices as distinct from hypnotism. Hubbard's awareness of fixating attention is of special interest. He speaks of it in the lectures recorded in the first Research and Discovery series, so they're given in 1950, on page 307 in the first edition. So causing hypnosis by fixating attention. So, for example, in training routine 0, which should be done for some hours, according to the bulletin that Hubbard wrote. So you can hypnotize someone by fixating their attention. He also gave examples of specific methods for inducing trance. I'm not going to do any more ASMR readings. You can actually hypnotize a person with sound alone. Then there's the proposition of setting up a carrier wave by pounding monotonously on a dishpan with a spoon and saying with each clang, "Sleep," which will often put a catatonic into hypnotic trance. How do you tell if a catatonic person is in hypnotic trance? It's beyond me. And there is another brand of hypnotism whereby the hypnotist grabs the patient by the throat, clamps him on the back of the head, shuts off the blood flow to his brain, rocks him back and forth about 3 times, shouting at him, "Sleep, sleep, sleep." It works on quite a few patients. And bearing in mind that we've learned earlier that hypnotism only works on 1 in 10. That could be the method for you. Obedience to authority as trance. According to Hubbard, trance states are common and can even be induced through the normal procedures of education. I remember finding this passage long after I'd left. When you're reading the things that aren't on the courses, all this massive material and searching out things. And it made me gasp when I read this. In altitude teaching, somebody is a great authority. He's probably teaching some subject that is far more complex than it should be. He has become defensive down through the years, and this is a sort of protective coating that he puts up, along with the idea that the subject will always be a little better known by him than by anybody else, and that there are things to know in this subject which he really wouldn't let anybody else in on. This is altitude instruction, preaching from on high. And the first bit that got me was, he's a great authority. He's probably teaching some subjects far more complex than it should be. Now, I personally think you could reduce all of the ideas of Scientology to a single book quite easily. I think you could reduce the basic ideas of Scientology to probably about 40 pages, because those ideas are extrapolated further and further. So the basic methods of auditing, yes, you've got 500 ways of asking somebody a question about their memory, but they'll only fit into 2 possible techniques. One of them is the straight wire, which means they use their ordinary everyday memory, and the other is to look into the reactive mind, which probably doesn't exist, but those are the only 2 actual methods, and they then become hundreds of different processes and procedures. The same is true with the visualization, the creative processing, which has pretty much dropped out of Scientology now because the old OT levels used to come from the book Creation of Human Ability. I hope I haven't upset anybody by revealing that. So, here he is saying that there's only going to be one expert. He's become defensive down through the years, and this is a protective coating, along with the idea that the subject will always be a little better known by him than by anybody else. Come on, guys. He said that the only contributions made to his technology were minor, that every major idea was his and he didn't trust anybody else. So he knows more about the subject. He wouldn't really let anybody else in on it. This is altitude instruction. So you're no longer a collaborator in the community of learning, which is how I consider myself to be. You are the authority. You are the sole authority. Interesting what happened in the later years. As to just the sheer quantity of material in Scientology, 3,500 lectures, thousands and thousands of bulletins, policy letters, executive directives, flag orders, orders of the day, all of the books and recombinations of the books. He produced an incredible volume of work, which fits absolutely within that definition of altitude instruction. And indeed, I see that I mentioned it here. It would be a good idea if I read these things before reading them out, but just isn't enough time, As an aside, it's worth mentioning that Hubbard was later to assert that every major tenet in Scientology and Dianetics was his exclusive discovery. See the Hubbard Communications Office policy letter, Keeping Scientology Working, of February 1965. Hubbard continued, and in order to get people to sit very alertly and do exactly what he says, he has another trick. He gives them examinations. So there's this anxiety around a person's grades, and this comes forward until he finally gets up to a point in education where when somebody says the word examination to him, it not only push buttons him, but it also threatens mama, papa, love, and general survival. It's a terrific whip. It keeps people in a state of confusion, and when their minds are slightly confused, they are in a hypnotic trance. And when we were at Toronto in 2015, Steve Hassan pointed this out. Confusion is the basic method of inducing trance, used as a trick by people. So here you are. He's aware of this. Anybody did it. And when their minds are slightly confused, they're in a hypnotic trance. Anytime anybody gets enough altitude, it can be called a hypnotic operator. And what he says will act as hypnotic suggestion. That is a thought. One's relationship with Hubbard. Well, of course, everything he said was true. He tells me I've got to check everything, but I don't need to bother because he says it's true. When their minds are slightly confused, they could be said to be in a hypnotic trance. Anytime anybody gets enough altitude, it can be called a hypnotic operator. And what he says will act as hypnotic suggestion. Hypnotism is a difference in levels of altitude. There are ways to create and lower the altitude of the subject, but if the operator can heighten his own altitude with regard to the subject the same way, he doesn't have to put the subject to sleep. What he says will still react as hypnotic suggestion. That's to say that there's nothing indicating that the person is in a trance. But because they feel that their relationship towards the other person is one of an inferior, that that person is superior to them, a guru, whatever that person says will act directly upon them as a command to do something, a hypnotic suggestion. This I'm interpreting. This is what Hubbard is saying here. And as I say in the text, this is a point which should be considered long and hard by anyone who has been involved with Dianetics or Scientology. To what extent were you put into a confused state? To what extent did you follow directions and believe things without checking them? And to what extent did you go against your own conscience because of that and justify it to yourself? And round it goes. Hubbard also gave advice on avoiding this induction of trance. In learning, study what you want to know. Think what you want to think about it. Recognize institutionalism for the bogus straw man it is. And keep the analyzer whirring. So think about the standard Scientology course room, if you've been in one, or people marching around in navy uniforms with pretend campaign ribbons on. And think about institutionalism, which is apparently a bogus straw man. I'm not quite sure what a bogus straw man is. Because a real straw man, is that the opposite of a real straw man? Or I don't know. So, in learning, study what you want to know. Don't follow the check sheet. Think what you want to think about it. You don't have to agree with it. Recognize institutionalism for the bogus straw man it is, and keep the analyzer whirring. That last bit, that's the time when I agree with L. Ron Hubbard. It does happen sometimes. Keep the analyzer whirring. Keep going. I'm not quite sure about that, actually. This strongly suggests that we should forget standard tech or a bridge, taking only what is useful, if indeed any of it is. I think there are probably better ways of doing everything than Hubbard offered us. Ease of trance induction. Hubbard warned his followers to recognise the depth these trances achieve just on no provocation. Tell a man to close his eyes, bong, he goes into an amnesia trance. Despite the ease with which people go into trance, and closing the eyes is a requirement of the Dianetic method, Hubbard said at no time should the auditor permit the pre-clear to be under the delusion that he is being hypnotised. And our next section is trance in Dianetics. Hubbard was aware of the signs of trance. A pre-clear after he closes his eyes will begin to flutter his eyelids. This is a symptom of the very lightest level of hypnotic trance. A simple test is to watch the person's eyeballs. You will find as he lies there that the eyeballs under the closed eyelids will hunt back and forth. Rapid eye movement. You can see the bump of them on the eyelids and they will be wandering. The hunting indicates a hypnotic state. The eye moving underneath the eyelid is the indication of when a person is lightly or deeply tranced. That's the second stage, of which the fluttering eyelid is the first. It was in a lecture from 1950-51. The pre-clear's eyes will roll a little bit under the lids. And when he returns, particularly, the eyelashes will flutter, which tells you immediately that he has become more suggestible than he ordinarily would be. Sometimes you'll notice a tremble on the eyelids. This means the pre-clear has deepened his sense of sleep and has left some of his attention units somewhere. This is a very early stage of hypnosis. Be careful of such a patient. The current, and this was written originally in 93, this is a version of 1995, but this is still the case. The original Dianetic method was put aside in 1951. It was cancelled by Hubbard because it was hypnotic. Don't want to give the game away too much, but it was cancelled. It returned more than 25 years later, and there was a course that you basically read the book and you did it exactly the way the book said, even though he later said this is a form of hypnosis. The current use of the Hubbard Dianetics Auditor course and the Hubbard Dianetics Seminar is in total contradiction to these admonitions. By returning to the 1950 method, Scientology has returned to direct trance induction. Both of these courses give, when the pre-clear's eyes close and you notice his eyelids flicker, finish counting. And you then carry on with your auditing session. These are not the only signs. If the person begins to answer you literally, that means your pre-clear is now a hypnotic subject and you are running him in hypnosis. We won't talk any of this. I did, 6 what are called major auditor training courses, counsellor training courses. This was not on any of these courses, with the exception that the bits of it that come from the book Dianetics, that you did have to read. But most of this comes from lectures that I didn't see until after I left. All of them, these are from published books, from Bridge Publications or New Era Publications, the two publishing houses of Scientology. So they're official publications. And probably by now you can actually get the lectures, the recordings themselves, if you really want to check on this. Regression, age regression. Although Hubbard had said in Dianetics, returning is substituted for regression, he reverted to the term in the following. You can't deliver any positive suggestions to a person when he has regressed and have it stick very hard. The person has regressed, he's wide awake, he is as wide awake as he can possibly be. In contradiction to this, Hubbard said, returning back down the track slightly increases the suggestibility of any person, so he's not as wide awake as anybody can be. Some people are immune to hypnotism. You cannot put anybody into a trance when he is stuck somewhere down the track, fixated upon the past or within the past, and is in general badly aberrated against going to sleep. This seems like a contradiction in terms, as the person stuck somewhere down the track is already technically in a regression trance. Hubbard was insistent, however, that to be hypnotized, the person should be in present time. Don't need to hypnotize them if they're already hypnotized, okay? The discovery of Dianetics. The key to Dianetics came from hypnotism. This is from Dianetics, the Evolution of a Science, published early in 1950. When a patient was bucked through a period when he was unconscious, he showed some improvement. Then it was discovered that these unconscious periods were rather like periods of hypnosis, driven home by pain. The patient responded as if the unconscious period had been post-hypnotic suggestion. This was the discovery of the engram, which according to Hubbard is the single and sole source of aberration and psychosomatic illness, which is to say conscious thought cannot be aberrative, and the human being would be perfect if only all the engrams were removed. Hubbard soon discovered that his assertion was ill-founded, and Scientology, created in 1952, quickly went beyond engram hunting. And at this point, if you can get it, Hayakawa wrote an amazing review. He was a senator, and he was the head of the, I think he was a state senator in California, but he was the head of General Semantics after Count Alfred Korzybski died, one of the main sources for Dianetics. And he wrote a review of Dianetics in a magazine called ETC, etc., in 1951, where he makes the impish suggestion that improvement can also come through education. So, the somatic, reactive and analytical minds and the monitor. Putting aside the many contradictions, Hubbard said, hypnotism is a laboratory tool that has served as a means of examining minds and getting their reactions. He claimed to have discovered a big monitoring switchboard of the body that by various means handles such things as blood circulation and endocrine flow. This tallies with his statements about regulating circulation and endocrine activity through hypnotism. However, having made this observation, Hubbard abandoned it, turning instead to the notion that a genetic entity governed bodily activity. That's in what was originally called What Toward It, is now sold as Scientology, History of Man, -1 chapter. Initially, Hubbard termed this the somatic mind. It has no thought and functions on a stimulus-response basis, which is to say, it is a hypnotic mind. In Dianetics modern science, that would later become the genetic entity, the GE. So you didn't have to worry about that anymore. In Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health, Hubbard hypothesized that the mind is divided into three parts: the somatic mind, the reactive mind, and the analytical mind. The analytical mind is the conscious, aware mind. It should not be confused with the short-term memory, or working memory, of conventional psychology. In that model, which has considerable experimental support, the awareness or short-term memory, working memory, is capable of holding at most 9 chunks of information. Many people say 7. At most 9, so I can see some going, no, the books say 7, the authorities say 7. But it's not true. There was work done that said 7 plus or minus 2.
Yeah, so the whole would be 9.
9, yeah. So that's how I got to that number, using a little bit of mathematical stuff. Everything else is beneath consciousness, according to contemporary psychology. And the notion of how consciousness and the unconscious relate is actually a many splendid thing and well worth thinking about. Definitely recommend Merlin Donald, A Mind So Rare. What a great book by an experimental psychologist who basically writes off nearly all of conventional wisdom at the moment. It's a lovely book. A very brilliant man. But the idea is that we interact with the unconscious part of the mind. The mind, if that's not just the mind part of the mind we're not conscious of. What Hubbard is saying that there's a part of the unconscious mind that's not available to us under normal circumstances, and that is directing us. That's the reactive mind. The contents of short-term memory are ever-changing in a normal person, so that's not the analytical mind. Hubbard's analytical mind is held to be distinct from the reactive mind, which operates beneath consciousness. Each of them, the analytical and the reactive, has its own memory banks. The analytical mind is a computing machine. In 1950, the comparison was really being made to a numerical calculator, not to a computer in the contemporary sense of the word. Hubbard was in fact comparing the human mind to a valve-driven number cruncher. And in my case, that's probably an apt comparison. Above the analytical mind is the monitor, The monitor can be considered part of the analytical mind. The monitor could be called the center of awareness of the person, what would later become the thetan. It, inexactly speaking, is the person. It has been approximated by various names for thousands of years, each one reducing down to I, the single letter I. The monitor is in control of the analytical mind. However, the mind is so constructed that there are several monitors. They can be activated on a stimulus-response basis, but they have no concept of individuality. That's a really interesting thought, that. So how many of me are there in here? I don't know. I'm not here. The analogy between hypnotism and aberration. During the course of his frequent use of hypnotism, Hubbard started to hypothesize about the reactive mind. Indeed, the reactive mind is an attempt to explain hypnotic phenomena. The analogy between hypnotism and aberration bears out well, he says in Dianetics. The reactive mind is supposedly capable of all manner of tricks. Take the case of a person who has been hypnotized and has been told that there is a chair in the centre of the room. This, in effect, is an agreement entered into between the hypnotist and the person who is hypnotized that there is a chair in the centre of the room. The person who is hypnotized is temporarily cut off from the rest of mankind and finds that his only communication and his only affinity for the duration of the hypnosis is with the hypnotic operator. Hypnotists call this positive hallucination, seeing something that isn't there, as opposed to negative hallucination, not seeing something that is there. Hubbard's analogies for the human mind tend to involve hypnotic sessions. Having explained a particular instance of post-hypnotic positive suggestion, Hubbard added, "In this we have the visible factors of how the reactive mind operates." Hubbard defined the reactive mind thus: this reactive mind is an infestation of foreign, careless and unreasoning commands which disrupt the self-determinism of the individual to such an extent that he no longer has charge through his analytical mind of the organism itself, but finds himself under the continual and chronic orders of unseen, never reviewed exterior forces, often and usually antipathetic to the survival of the organism. The theory of Dianetics was confirmed for Hubbard by a straightforward experiment, again from the book Dianetics. If in hypnotic trance you examine a patient's memory of an operation, these incidents, the engrams, are the only periods in the banks you will not find. So people can't remember stuff from when they were unconscious, apparently. Chains. Through hypnotism, Hubbard also believed he had confirmed Freud's idea that earlier trauma holds later trauma in place. It says the Freud lecture was 1909 here. I keep telling people it was 1911, so I'm wrong. Well, I'm either wrong here or I'm wrong there, you know. But these are the Clark lectures in Massachusetts. The early hypnotic session is the more valid one, even if it's cancelled by a later hypnotic session. The earlier suggestion has priority. The earlier the period of unconscious, the more likely it is to lift. It says unconscious there, not unconsciousness. That is the fundamental axiom of Dianetic therapy. The earlier the period of unconsciousness, I hope, the more likely it is to lift. That is the fundamental axiom, an axiom or self-evident truth of Dianetic therapy. Again, that's in the book Dianetics. Suggestibility. The proposed purpose of Dianetics is to awaken a person in every period of his life when he has been forced into unconsciousness. It is worth noting, however, that a strange thing about amnesia trance is that a person can be awakened into it. Further, despite his protestations that Dianetics is not hypnosis and that most people cannot be hypnotized, returning back down the track slightly increases the suggestibility of any person. So auditing will increase your suggestibility. Any person. Strengthening trance through repetition. In hypnotism, it's usual for the subject to enter trance more easily with each session. The same is true for the Dianetic pre-clear. After a person has been a pre-clear for quite a while, he ceases to be as well regimented as he once was. Then, if the auditor says, close your eyes, he may start to go back on the track, even with his eyes open. This obviously brings into question the idea in Scientology of model session, where sessions are supposed to run out earlier sessions because of their similarity to them. So he's kind of saying the opposite's true, which seems to be the case rather frequently in the works of Ron Hubbard. Dianetics can be used to play on another individual like a good organist plays on a Wurlitzer, that's a cinema organ of the time, knowing by observation the push buttons of another person, or, as in political Dianetics, a society, the organist can play whatever piece he likes at will. Advertising agencies, governments, and various leaders have done this by a sort of intuition all through man's history. They knew that by such and such stimulus they could achieve such and such response. In Dianetics, the matter is reduced not to a fine art, but to a very effective science. Unfortunately, educational Dianetics must concern itself in the non-academic field with push buttons. So we're going to use the reactive mind at this point, rather than relieving it. We're going to use it, unfortunately, as he says, in educational Dianetics. However, he also says education in another lecture. In fact, it's 4 pages later in the same volume of transcripts. Education, then, to be effective, no matter if it is the education of the education a mother gives her infant, or the professor gives the collegiate, must avoid becoming positive suggestion if it is to produce anything like an effective being. So one day he recommends it, and possibly later the same day he says it's a bad idea. Although the Dianetic practitioner or auditor can push button responses in others, short of the use of drugs as in narcosynthesis, hypnotism or surgery, no mistake can be made by the auditor which cannot be remedied either by himself or by another auditor. Oh dear. Auditor altitude. The auditor should adopt an air of detached efficiency toward the patient. In short, teach yourself some altitude. Exude self-confidence. Of course, within Hubbard's own teaching, achieving altitude is equivalent to becoming a hypnotic operator, as we heard earlier. He doesn't have to put the subject to sleep. What he says will still react as hypnotic suggestion. As to exuding confidence, Hubbard recommended a text to his followers which gives this advice. You must have absolute confidence in yourself. You must know that you will succeed. This is the first requisite to success in this science. However, in this case, the science was not Dianetics, but hypnotism. That's 25 Lessons in Hypnotism by L.E. Young, recommended by Hubbard in a lecture in 1950, and again in another one. This is one of the most garish works the present author has ever seen. Use of hypnotism in auditing. The auditor must be prepared to use hypnotism. He must know how it works, what he should do to make it function, how to regress a person in hypnotism, and so on, which is definitely very different from Dianetics in that one produces a trance. So, in my 9 years in Scientology, I never saw this. I did not see this, and it says the auditor must be prepared to use hypnotism. Those are Hubbard's words. He must know how it works. We were taught nothing about how it works. What he should do to make it function, taught nothing. How to regress a person in hypnotism, and so on. Which is definitely very different from Dianetics, in that one produces a trance. Well, I'd say it produces an altered state, and all altered states, every state we're in, well, which one's the normal one? Because which emotion is the proper normal one? So they're all altered states. And to call one a hypnotic state and another not isn't the most sensible thing in the world to do, because it leads you to the belief that there is this sort of separate other consciousness. There are many, many different states within any human being. All of your feelings, all of your emotions bring about different states. You can be sad, you can be happy. You can have indigestion, you can be in pain, you can have just had a swim and feel exhilarated. Whatever, there are many different states in the human being, and in some of them we're more suggestible than in others. When we're euphoric, very happy, we are particularly susceptible. And that is the aim of Scientology. In a Scientology session, to give you very good indicators, make you euphoric, which is an altered state. The engram has positive suggestion. The engram was seen by Hubbard in hypnotic terms. A simple approximation of the action of an engram can be accomplished by an experiment in hypnotism whereby a positive suggestion, which contains a post-hypnotic signal, is delivered to an amnesia-tranced person. The subject, having been commanded to forget the suggestion when awake, will then perform the act. Go to the street corner. Every week. It is literally interpreted, unquestionably followed, since it is received during a period of unawareness of the analytical mind or some portion of it. The re-stimulator, which may be the act of the operator adjusting his tie, causes the subject to commit some act. The subject will then try to explain why he is doing what he is doing, no matter how illogical that action may be. The release of the post-hypnotic suggestion into the analytical mind brings about rational thought. Engrams can be considered to be painfully inflicted, often timeless, post-hypnotic suggestions delivered antagonistically to the unconscious subject. The post-hypnotic suggestion would not have any permanent effect, even if it were not removed by the operator, because there was presumed to be no antagonism involved, unless, of course, it rested on a former engram. Okay, I think he's chasing his own tail a little bit there, whichever way you look at it. But an engram is a post-hypnotic suggestion, the equivalent of. Hubbard asserted that hypnotism attempts to plant positive engrams. Just put in another engram, an artificial one, into a man, even if it's a manic engram, makes the subject big or strong or powerful, plus all other perceptics or perceptions contained, and he's all right. That's the basic trouble. Trying to implant these ideas into somebody that they're doing fine. In hypnosis, one is trying to put in a good engram to counteract bad engrams, and it doesn't work. Positive suggestion allegedly goes down the track and will latch onto whatever is there. I mean, he would later be giving people engrams himself by chucking them overboard from his ship, sometimes bound hands and feet and blindfolded. Which I should imagine would be pretty traumatic, but there you go. A hypnotic induction, however, is not an engram. According to Hubbard's theory, there are three types of incident in the reactive mind. The engram, which is a recording made by the reactive mind when the analytical mind is unconscious. The secondary engram, or secondary, which is a mental image picture of a moment of severe and shocking loss or threat of loss, which contains misemotion. And that's a specific reference to a bulletin of the 23rd of April 1969, and the lock, which occurs when aspects of the environment approximate those of an engram. So engram, secondary, lock. Thus, keying in the engram. According to Hubbard, hypnotism can be considered as a high-powered lock. Positive suggestions may append themselves to engrams and become locks. Narcosynthesis and amnesia trance are dangerous because they can permanently key in engrams. So your active mind's in total control. Indeed, everything that you run in amnesia trance becomes a lock. Positive suggestions only have force because they are locks upon engrams. I never found a positive suggestion capable of doing more than reinforcing an engram. Yet suggestion is thoroughly permanent until relieved by Dianetic processing. And hypnotism may be sufficiently destructive to cause the engrams to re-stimulate to the point of insanity. So, positive suggestions only have the force of locks, but they can drive you crazy. As already cited, submission to being hypnotized is analogous to being raped, with the exception that the individual can generally recover from being raped. Yet, they're just locks. While recommending hypnotic anesthesia, Hubbard adds that Dianetics must be administered after the operation because not to pick it, that hypnotic period, not to pick it up would be equivalent to continuing a general anaesthetic forever after the operation. But unconsciousness of the non-hypnotic variety is a little more rugged. It takes more than a few passes of the hand to cause unconsciousness of the insanity-producing variety. And of course, we've just heard that you can cause insanity with hypnosis, but you have to thump them. There's also, that's on page 58 of my copy of Dianetics, but there's a footnote which runs over onto page 58 from page 57, which says that hypnotism can produce insanity. And on page 66, hypnotism plants by positive suggestion one or another form of insanity. There are gaps in the standard memory banks, i.e. the memory, that is the memory available to the analytical mind as opposed to the reactive memory banks, which take place during moments of unconsciousness, that's that state of being caused by anesthesia, drugs, injury or shock. This is the only data missing from a standard analytical mind, from the standard bank. Having made absolute statements about the difference between hypnotic amnesia and the engram, Hubbard also asserted that the post-hypnotic suggestion needs only an emotional charge and physical pain to make it a dangerous engram. Actually, it is an engram of a sort. The suggestion is data fused into the circuits of the body below the command level of the analytical mind. Hubbard also asserted that all hypnotic commands are no more than artificially implanted engrams. Hypnotism is simply another engram. An engram is actually a hypnotic suggestion. I'm quoting from 3 different sources there. And Dianetic therapy removes engrams. Hypnotism installs engrams. Reveries and trance. Dianetic processing, as Hubbard called his system processing, Dianetic processing is done with the preclear in a state of reverie. His use of this word was to cause Hubbard heartache later on. Reverie is a word used by hypnotists to denote a light state of trance, a state in which the hypnotic subject can appear to be completely awake. Hubbard recommended the book Hypnotism Comes of Age to his followers. This text describes hypnagogic reverie as a dreamlike state between normal consciousness and hypnosis. While reverie is not the only tool that can be used in Dianetic auditing, it is the best tool to use, according to Hubbard. Hubbard was emphatic. To turn down the analytical level and then go ahead and audit is a very bad idea. He said you can audit somebody when they're asleep. He said you can audit them in a trance. You can audit them when they're catatonic. But to turn down the analytical level and then go ahead and audit is a very bad idea. Reverie was defined by Hubbard as a light state of concentration, not to be confused with hypnosis. So a light state of concentration would not be a strong sense of concentration, would it? And that wouldn't be concentration, would it? It's not something that really comes in different flavours. You're either concentrating or you're not. So he's actually used hypnotic confusion within the phrase, a light state of concentration, which is really fascinating. And I certainly didn't notice it any of the 3 times I read this book when I was a member. So, in reverie, the person is fully aware of what is taking place. The use of the words light state seems to be a Freudian slip. It's certainly a contradiction in terms. Dianetic reverie, per Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health, is induced in the following manner. The auditor makes very sure that the patient is not hypnotised by telling him, before he begins to count, you will know everything which goes on. You will be able to remember everything that happens. You can exercise your own control. These are positive suggestions, by the way. If you do not like what is happening, you can instantly pull out of it. Now 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. To make doubly sure, for we want no hypnotism, even by accident, the auditor installs a canceller. It is a contract with the patient that whatever the auditor says will not become literally interpreted by the patient or used by him in any way. It is installed immediately after the condition of reverie is established. A canceller is worded more or less as follows. In the future, when I utter the word cancelled, everything which I have said to you while you are in a therapy session will be cancelled and will have no force with you. Any suggestion I have made to you will be without force when I say the word cancelled. Do you understand? We did this at Toronto, of course, demonstrated it with Christian and Chris Shelton. The canceller is vital. It prevents accidental positive suggestion. And if you believe that, you'll believe anything. Of course, to work, the canceller would have to be itself a positive suggestion. It's worthy of note that Dianetics, as described in Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health, is still in use as an aspect of the Church of Scientology's supposed therapy system. However, only a small portion of the individual's auditing will consist of this original Dianetics, and the canceller is not used with any other form of auditing. So what is said to you may remain as positive suggestion, according to Hubbard's ideas. After Dianetics, Modern Science of Mental Health was published, Hubbard withdrew the system of counting the pre-clear into reverie. Sometimes people go into a hypnotic trance by accident with this count system, so at the foundation, we no longer use it. That's a lecture. Unfortunately, this advice is ignored in the current Hubbard Dianetics Auditor course. Auditing reverts entirely to Dianetics, Modern Science of Mental Health. So by Hubbard's own statement, the Church of Scientology is using a hypnotic induction as standard procedure, count slowly and soothingly, from 1 to 7, just prior to the flickering of the eyelids already mentioned. Hubbard was perfectly aware that counting out loud is a method of hypnotic induction, used to this day. Reverie is induced easily. Close your eyes. The pre-clear is now in reverie. Open your eyes. The pre-clear is now out of reverie. A person wide awake could be said to be in reverie. Is that with their eyes open or closed? I'm not sure anymore. The reverie used in Dianetics merely consists of shutting the eyes in order to help the person to remember, recall and recount past incidents in complete detail. It is not induced by commands of any kind, and can hardly be called trance, sleep, slumber, or even catnap. The person in reverie is keenly, acutely aware and analytical of everything said to him, and can open his eyes of his own free will at any time during the session. Hubbard also said, however, that analytical ability is attenuated during auditing. He calls anaten. And that sometimes a pre-clear will be unable to recall what engram was run during a session, which sounds very like hypnotic amnesia. The disoriented Boyle-off state of auditing is also readily comparable to the altered states of other trance-inducing techniques. The state of reverie is actually just a name. It's a label introduced to make the patient feel that his state has altered and that he has gone into a state where his memory is very good. So you're persuading the person that they're in an altered state, but it's not an altered state. Or where he can do something he couldn't ordinarily do before. It is not a strange state. Hubbard then blithely added, also counting sometimes produces a light hypnosis back of the reverie, which is sometimes helpful on the case. Of a pre-clear who had experienced burping after being returned to babyhood, Hubbard said, this is definitely not power of suggestion, since the pre-clear is wide awake and alert. This statement is difficult to follow. Post-hypnotic suggestions are carried out by subjects after the hypnotic session, when wide awake. Further, what had stimulated the burping in the first place? It could hardly be a conscious decision. As engrams are themselves held to be positive suggestion by Hubbard, the statement seems impossible to unravel. This is definitely not power of suggestion, since the pre-clear is wide awake and alert. While in reverie, then, the pre-clear is wide awake, but his attention is wholly engaged with returning to past events contained in reactive memory banks. Again, Hubbard forgot that he had abandoned the hypnotist term regression, saying, you can't deliver any positive suggestions to a person when he has regressed and have it stick very hard. The person is regressed. He is wide awake. He is as wide awake as he can possibly be, as I've already said. Thought we'd throw that back in there again, obviously. Reverie is held to be far superior to all other methods. The word, by the way, reverie comes from the word rev for dream, dreaming, being in a dream state. Just as the word hypnosis comes from the word hypnos, meaning sleep. Neither of these is quite true, but reverie is quite close to it, that you do go into a light state of concentration, where you're directable by somebody else, where your mind is being directed by somebody else, and your imagination is being guided. And, of course, one of the technical definitions of hypnosis in the Oxford Handbook of Hypnosis is simply guided imagination. So somebody who's directing you within your mind could be said to be hypnotizing you. Within these models, what I believe might be slightly different to this, but the reverie has a clear at its end. Drugs and hypnotism have dependency on the auditor and many other undesirable effects. So strange implication there that there are auditors who use drugs and hypnotism. Because how would he have seen that they'd created this dependency? Otherwise, that's a bit odd. But is reverie anything other than a form of light trance? Hubbard is once again ambivalent. The matter of inducing reverie requires some judgment. There are cases in which you might want to induce a little deeper state of suggestibility than you have achieved. Just have him, the pre-clear, look you in the eye for a few minutes and talk to him quietly, and then tell him to close his eyes, and you will find out that he has quieted down considerably. As to the use of counting to induce reverie, in the current Dianetics Auditor course and seminar, the following has already been cited. Recognise the depth these trances achieve just on no provocation. Tell a man to close his eyes. Bong! He goes into an amnesia trance. Or sometimes use the old counting technique, and it becomes more frequent. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Bong! However, Dianetic technique is not hypnotism in any remote sense of the word. In the process, he, the pre-clear, remains entirely awake. But you will occasionally find severely neurotic people who don't work well, who are very upset, and they will become quieter when you have counted at them for a while. But they are not in a good, solid trance. Why the auditor would want the severe neurotic in a good, solid trance is not explained. Having said that fluttering of the eyelids is indicative of trance, Hubbard gave the following instructions for inducing reverie. The patient is made to lie down and shut his eyes. The operator begins to count. He suggests the patient relax. Relax. At length, the patient's eyelids will flutter. Medicine drumming will also accomplish this without producing a harmful amnesia hypnotic state. He is permitted to relax further. Then the operator tells him that his motor strip, his sensory perceptions, is returning to a time of unconsciousness. With coaxing, the patient will begin to feel the injury and sense himself in the location and time of the accident. This statement, which comes from Hubbard's first published article on Dianetics, shows an interesting choice of words. The auditor is called the operator. He suggests that the pre-clear relax into a state which is not a harmful amnesia hypnotic state, which does not rule out light trance or even harmless amnesia. And the engram is found through coaxing. The canceller. The canceller statement is also of great interest. After the publication of Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, Hubbard spoke of a renowned hypnotist who was running a series of tests so that we will know exactly what effect installing a canceller will have. Before the results from these tests were in, however, Hubbard had already confidently asserted the canceller very neatly scoops up the material as you say it to a patient, even if he's hypnotised. However, by June 1951, this safeguard had been abandoned because the pre-clear was meant to systematically recall earlier auditing sessions to remove any hypnotic influence, so it hadn't worked. This practice, along with the canceller, finds no place in later forms of auditing, nor is any mention made of the possible hypnotic effect of these later forms. The importance of hypnotism. Hubbard did his initial research using hypnotism. The major discoveries of Dianetics were made in hypnotic sessions. Pre-clears may already be in a trance state or may accidentally go into trance as a consequence of auditing procedures. In hypnotism, we have the visible factors of how the reactive mind operates. As already cited, the auditor must be prepared to use hypnotism. He must know how it works, what he should do to make it function, how to regress a person in hypnotism, and so on. Hubbard also asserted, if you are a very smart auditor, you will not throw away the advantages of the power of suggestion completely. Suggestion does have its uses when it is controlled and one knows what one is doing. I'm not talking about hypnotic suggestion. I am talking about just the simple matter of cheering somebody up and a good bedside manner. In lectures given in 1950, Hubbard recommended 3 books on hypnotism to his followers. Anyone in doubt as to how hypnotism works need only consult the authoritative books on the subject by Estabrooks, a book called Hypnotism by George Hoban Estabrooks. In fact, this is recommended as a means of proving that Dianetics and hypnotism are total strangers. There is a little book by a man by the name of Young, written about 1899, which contains in it about as much hypnosis as one ever wants. It is called 25 Lessons in Hypnosis. Practically everything in that book works, and clairvoyance, mesmerism, and so forth are also delineated. The third and most significant work recommended is Wolf and Rosenthal's Hypnotism Comes of Age. Despite protestations that hypnotism and Dianetics are total strangers, Hubbard several times advocated the use of hypnotism alongside Dianetics. It's even allowable to use actual hypnosis if it is possible to procure any results from it. So hypnosis has some value, but it has value only to a professional auditor. If he can spill emotion in deep trance or even in narcosynthesis, he has achieved a gain on the case. This is for a very special, tough type of case. Hypnosis and Dianetics are not the only approaches. Faith healing, when not practiced on the hypnotic level of this is not going to hurt you anymore, has ingredients that you can use. Faith healing has ingredients that you can use. I hope Benny Hinn is out there, ready to train some people. Auditors do need to be aware of hypnotism. It is quite usual for the auditor to have to exhaust hypnotically implanted material received either from some hypnotist or from the analytical mind itself when the person has been operating under auto-control. Also, it is pertinent to diagnosis whether or not the pre-clear is highly suggestible or can be hypnotized. Further, understanding the mechanism of post-hypnotic suggestion can aid an understanding of aberration. The next thing an auditor should know well is the effect of hypnotism and drugs, and he should have observed this actually. These are from 4 different sources. The auditor should be aware of hypnotism because, as already cited, hypnotism is very common in this society. It wouldn't have been as common if Hubbard hadn't been using it on so many people. Unfortunately, auditors share an ignorance of hypnotism with the general populace and simply parrot Hubbard's calming assurance that auditing is not a form of hypnosis, or that auditing removes hypnosis. Despite their implanted obsession with the meaning of words, Scientologists are largely unable to define the hypnosis which auditing supposedly removes, in my experience. They believe it to be drowsiness or lack of awareness, rather than the heightened state known to hypnotic subjects and touched upon by Hubbard in Dianetics and Modern Science of Mental Health. By suggestion, the power of hearing can be tuned down or up so that a person is nearly deaf or can hear pins fall at a great distance. Most usually, hypnotic trance is a state of heightened awareness which excludes certain perceptions. It is a highly focused state, often accompanied by a sensation that the colours in the room are brighter, as well as spatial dissociation, called exteriorization by Scientologists, and depersonalization by psychiatrists. If you can't get back in from the sensation, you are depersonalized. Hubbard also wrote of the possibility of a pre-clear accidentally going into deep trance. Then there are the people who will turn up for an auditing session already in a trance state. A lot of children are in light trance. Children are quite suggestible. The curve of hypnosis rises steadily until its highest level about 10 years of age and then falls clear off at about 15 or 16. Then they don't believe anything. There are actually 2 types of hypnotic states that people wander around in. And he does say states, not state there. They are either regressed back down the track someplace, but not in a real trance, or they wander around in a permanent light hypnotic trance, or they do both. So they're stuck somewhere back in time, or they're in a light hypnotic trance, or both. Strangely enough, these people cannot be hypnotized for the simple reason that they are already asleep. Everything said to such a person may be engrammic, may have a command value. Sometimes a person will go into hypnotic trance in spite of anything you can do. None of this was taught to me. I was not warned about this. Some people, when told to close their eyes, immediately go into hypnotic trance. I didn't know this. Sometimes you find people who have been taught to do auto-self-hypnosis. Well, we could have had auto or self there, either would have done. This is gruesome. Handwritten Hubbard documents submitted as evidence during the Church of Scientology International case against Gerald Armstrong in 1984 make it clear that Hubbard used self-hypnosis abundantly in the years leading up to Dianetics. For example, when you tell people you are ill, it has no effect upon your health, and in Veterans Administration examinations, you'll tell them how sick you are. You'll look sick when you take it. You'll return to health 1 hour after the examination and laugh at them. Okay. That's in the transcript of the Armstrong case, pages 1925 to 1927. The apathy case, to some degree, is in a permanent hypnotic trance and will listen to and believe anything said, no matter how ridiculous it may be. Suggestion. Hubbard was ambiguous about suggestion. We never give positive suggestions, but you are putting in positive suggestion whether you want to or not, no matter how careful you are. So we never do it, but you are doing it. However, chatter doesn't do much harm unless the patient is hypnotized, or when in order to find his preclear unusually suggestive, he should be very careful what he says. So, whether hypnotized or not. There's a conflict about the nature of questions, commands, and suggestions. Dianetic commands are not positive suggestions. They are simply outright commands, no matter how persuasively put. The somatic strip will go to, it's there. That's not a suggestion, it is there. But all auditor desires should be stated as questions if possible, as these are not aberrative to the degree that commands are. I'll point out that during my time, 9 years I spent, I was told that I was not asking questions, but making commands. They're called auditing commands. They're never, in my experience, called auditing questions. So he changed his mind, or maybe he didn't change his mind. That was the thing that worried me when I was putting this material together, that he seems very aware of certain things that he will later do. And we should be concerned about that, especially as his advice is that we should study hypnosis and understand it thoroughly. And I would recommend that. Not practicing it, not learning how to do it, but seeing how it is done. And the comparisons that you can make between Scientology auditing and hypnotherapy and hypnotic procedures. And again, you're putting in positive suggestion whether you want to or not, no matter how careful you are. When the preclear is returned to some point prior to present time, this moment, the auditor should under no circumstances use more words than are absolutely necessary. The preclear may be receptive to hypnotic suggestions. You have got to minimize what you say to him, and you have got to put most of what you say to him in questions. In other words, reduce the positive command level. Also, reduce the sharpness of your voice, because at that moment, you're putting another I slightly behind the front edge of the analyzer. And that is, in essence, what hypnosis does. So if your voice is too sharp, then you will displace the locus of control in that person, the I. And I wasn't warned about that. Anything implanted by positive suggestion or education in the course of auditing is harmful and must be cancelled if delivered. That's Dianetics, the original thesis. Although Hubbard asserted that hypnotism can be very dangerous and that preclears can readily go into trance during auditing, he insisted that Dianetics can cause no harm. Short of the use of drugs as in narcosynthesis, hypnotism or surgery, no mistake can be made by the auditor which cannot be remedied, either by himself or by another auditor, as we've already heard. And that again is from the book Dianetics. The preclear can in no way be damaged by Dianetic technique. So the fact that you might be accidentally installing engrams won't be harmful. The mind is a self-protecting mechanism, he says in Dianetics. And if that's so, then why are engrams dangerous? Self-protecting mechanism. Seeing all of this material close together rather than spread through hundreds of pages is a dizzying experience. None of Hubbard's statements have been withdrawn. Indeed, it is a sin to even suggest withdrawal or correction. See Technical Degrades, Policy Letter 17th June 1970. It is a, capital letters, high crime, labelling any material background or not used now or old. Which of these conflicting statements is true, and what kind of science could possibly consist of such a mess of contradictions? In Scientology, the rule of thumb is, which statement is most recent? But the foregoing shows Hubbard gaily contradicting himself repeatedly in the same text, and then reversing and re-reversing his opinions from week to week. Factually, the public are being lied to, with the continued publication of at least half of these contradictions. The caveat emptor rule does apply, let the buyer beware, which is pointed out in the small print at the beginning of most current Scientology books. Scientology is a science when it's being sold, but a religion if you want your money back. This investigation of Hubbard's statements about hypnosis is by no means exhaustive. A search through the indices of Hubbard's books, not referred to here, will turn up yet more insights and contradictions. And come on, guys, I've been waiting for, 25 years for somebody to do this now. 25 years? Yeah, 25 years. It's just go and find these things. Stop whittering on about, your time in Scientology or how you got bad auditing or what have you. Go and do some digging and find me some more quotations that Hubbard made about suggestion and reverie and hypnosis. Well, no, don't find them for me. I don't really want to spend the rest of my life doing this stuff. Anyway, the false data stripping technique should be used first on itself and then on Scientology. Hubbard told you, find out what's true. Look it all up, check it all out. And did you follow his advice? Yeah, well, if you're a good Scientologist, you did, and you left. And we're no longer a Scientologist. So use false data stripping first on false data stripping. Find the error in the false data stripping material. The one I've mentioned elsewhere is that he attributes the syllogism to Socrates in the false data stripping policy letters. And in the Phoenix lectures in 1954, he got it right. It was Aristotle. So it just amused me when I first read it that there was false data in the false data stripping policy letter. And he was saying that false data has such a profound effect upon us, that it messes up so badly. And yet there it is, Socrates and the syllogism. So use if you want to, if you're so inclined, use false data stripping on the false data stripping material, and you'll find there are errors in it. And then turn it on Scientology itself, remembering that you can control that individual to whom you have given sufficient contradictions. By the way, one piece, then talk about the syllogism, there it is. So I should read these things before doing this. The ridiculous rewording of Buddha's Kalama Sutta into what's true for you is true must be rejected. The lesson, as already quoted, is, in learning, study what you want to know, think what you want to think about it, recognise institutionalism for the bogus straw man it is, and keep the analyzer whirring. Now, I'm going to do something I often do, and that is I'm going to read out a paragraph from the Kalama Sutta by the Buddha, Gautama Siddhartha. Do not put faith in traditions, even though they have been accepted for long generations and in many countries. Do not believe a thing because many repeat it. Do not accept a thing on the authority of one or another of the sages of old, nor on the ground that a statement is found in the books. Never believe anything because probability is in its favour. Do not believe in that which you have yourselves imagined, thinking that a god has inspired it. Believe nothing, merely on the authority of your teachers or of the priests. After examination, believe that which you have tested for yourselves and found reasonable, which is in conformity with your well-being and that of others. He was a clever dude. There it is, 2,500 years ago. Bang. Just apply this to your life, It seems unlikely that the Buddha would have approved of the use of hypnosis, or indeed of the fair game law and harassing people. Having explained his own long involvement with hypnotism, and that most of the principles of Dianetics and the Dianetic model of the mind stemmed from that involvement, Hubbard added, a motto one could use is, never believe a hypnotist. I'm John Atack. Thank you very much.